Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming this evening. My name is Charles Duggan. I'm the Heritage Officer here in Dublin City Council. This isn't strictly Dublin City Council, although we own the property. Thank you for joining us for this evening's lecture by Dr. Joyce Ulysses. Her talk is entitled Christopher Eiffe,
Eiffe.
Yeah, and the Caledonian Insurance Company in Dublin. This year we have curated a wide-ranging lineup of talks that explore diverse subjects. The full autumn schedule, most of which you've missed if you haven't been here before, is on the screen. And with the series, we aim to amplify different voices, share fresh perspectives on familiar stories, and shed light on those that are less well known. We also seek to showcase groundbreaking research and new publications that enrich our understanding of Dublin's social, architectural, and cultural heritage. If you've missed any of our talks, you can watch them back on our YouTube channel, which is Dublin City Heritage, where you'll also find many other recordings of lectures on Dublin's built and cultural heritage. This series is an initiative of the Dublin City Strategic Heritage Plan and is made possible through a grant from the Heritage Council's County Heritage Plan grant scheme. Before I introduce Grace, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge those who've made this evening possible. First of all, a huge thank to my colleague, Abigail O'Reilly, whom you'll have met at the door, for her hard work in helping to organise this series. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Bernadette Ferguson, who's providing Irish Sign Language interpretation for us tonight, ensuring that everyone can fully participate in the event. And a special thank you, of course, to the Lord Mayor, Councillor Ray McAdam, and the wonderful staff of the Mansion House for graciously hosting us in this wonderful venue. Now on to our speaker. I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Joyce Ulysses. Grace completed her PhD on medieval Dublin in Trinity College. She is the editor of the always excellent quarterly periodical Archaeology Ireland, and is online editor of the History Ireland magazine. She has also works as a freelance historical consultant, and has worked on various projects for Dublin City Council, for the Royal Irish Academy, and of course for Royal London, Ireland. Would you please join me in giving Grace a warm welcome? Thank you.
Hi, how are you? Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much and welcome to this Oak Room talk. I'm actually going to start my talk by thanking a few people. Again, it's just to kind of acknowledge people whose help facilitated the research that I'm going to be talking about today. Firstly, I want to return the thanks to Charles for the invitation to come today. I'm thrilled to be able to share the research that I did for Royal London, Ireland with a different audience. This research came about initially at the behest of Joe Charles in Royal London, Ireland. RLI began life in Ireland as Caledonian Insurance. And in the last few decades, when they've been kind of looking at their history, they have always talked about themselves beginning in Ireland or arriving in Ireland in 1824. So in 2024, Joe had the idea, let's celebrate our 200th anniversary, and let's do that by having a little bit of a kind of a look back into our past and try and find out as much as we can. So I said, great, yeah, I'm up for that. Unfortunately, in one way, one of the very first results that I had as part of my research was to tell them that they were not, in fact, in Ireland for 200 years, that they had been mistaken about that. But they were very good about it. They took it on board and went with the research anyway, so I'll come back to that later. So thanks to Joe and to Royal London, Ireland for their interest in the company history and kind of for facilitating the research today. And then one area that I'm going to be covering a little bit tonight is the fire insurance aspect of the company, which is no longer part of their modern product range. And for help with this, I really want to acknowledge the generosity of Laz Fallon, who shared both his own publications, but also shared photos with me and just private information as well, and from his own research. Laz is actually giving a talk elsewhere tonight about his new book, which is about fire and the liberties, whiskey, fire and the liberties in the late 19th century, so he can't be here tonight, but I just want to kind of acknowledge that he was a huge help in the fire insurance aspect. Now, my talk today is kind of roughly divided into various sections, which sort of hopefully by the end will all come together to tell you a little bit about life in 19th century Dublin. I'm telling this story through the lens of the Scottish company Caledonian and their first manager in Ireland, Christopher Eiffe. I'm going to say Eiffe. I've never heard anybody say his name. So I'm just going to go with Eiffe. It could be something different. If anybody has any information on how it should be pronounced, please free to tell me, but I'm going to go with Eiffe. And his life gives us a fascinating little insight into the life of a 19th century Dubliner. Through his work with Caledonian, we're going to look at how the city managed fires before there was a municipal service. Through his personal life, we're going to have a little look at how an ordinary person could get involved with philanthropy, political reform, and as we'll see, long-running court cases and slander. Now, so there's that. Okay, now, one of Ireland's, we're going to start on a literary note, okay? It's a highbrow literary note. One of Ireland's most famous works of fiction, James Joyce's Ulysses, has its own day of celebration every year on the 16th of June, the date during which all the events in the novel take place. I'm going to begin then with a quote from a book which I initially didn't realise had such a strong insurance element, which tells you straight off that I haven't read Ulysses, because that wouldn't have come as a surprise to me if I'd read the book. But so I have two quotes here. Dignam's put the boots in. Houses of mourning, so depressing because you never know. Anyway, she wants the money. Must call to those Scottish widows as I promised. Strange name. Takes it for granted we're going to pop off first. And then later on, and I won't read through the whole thing, documents the birth certificate of Leopold Paula Bloom, an endowment insurance policy of £500 in the Scottish Widows Assurance Society, intestated Millicent Millie Bloom coming into force, and the rest. So we don't need to go through the whole quote. Now, insurance companies are not typically part of the Bloomsday celebration, certainly none that I've seen, but insurance is very, very much a part of Ulysses. Following the attendance at the funeral of his friend Paddy Dignam, Leopold Bloom takes on the task of finding Dignam's life insurance policy with the hope of securing payment for Dignam's widow and children. Now, the Scottish Widows Fund. The Scottish Widows Fund was set up at a time in the early 19th century when men who went to war did pop off first. But it was also a time when Scottish insurance companies were very successful at exporting their business model to Ireland. So on the left here is just a little extract from the Belfast newsletter, and it's an ad for the Scottish Widows Fund. The second one is probably the idea of the Scottish widows that maybe most of us will remember. The ad with the, certainly it's the first thing that always came to mind when you hear Scottish widows. The lady with the, you know, it's like the milk tray ad. It's one of those ads that just, however they change it, you'll always go back to the lady with the long black cloak. Now, the two most common insurance types in the 18th century were maritime and fire. Life insurance kind of really only comes into its own in the 19th century. And to be honest, I'm not really going to go into life insurance that much today. I did read up a lot about it as part of the overall research for this project. And there were lots of aspects that I have to admit I'd never really given any thought to before. So for instance, the impact of the famine on what was considered the insurability of Irish lives. And there's a very kind of uncomfortable reading in how British insurance companies in Ireland were trying to kind of publicly manage how they would take on Irish lives and how they would deal with people who were in the midst of a famine. And there were several companies who actually kind of pulled their pulled their policies in Ireland rather than have to deal with how to kind of manage the famine. There was also the actuarial computations that these British insurance companies developed to deal with Irish drinking habits. And there was quite a bit of discussion about how they would manage what they saw as the big difference between English lives and Irish lives. There was one story of a man who had his family had put in a claim from his life insurance and said, oh, you know, he was perfectly healthy and this is dreadful and, you know, give us the money. And the insurance company put in a little bit of research, you know, before they did the payout. And the report came back to say that nobody that they had spoke to basically could say that this man had ever been sober. So they weren't quite sure if they were going to pay out. So just gives you a little bit of an idea. And then in the 20th century, there's a whole interesting side to the insurance story and the national question, as it was called. And insurance became very, very political. And particularly the fact of Irish insurance companies being set up in kind of the first couple of decades of the 20th century and kind of competing with British companies in Ireland and that whole question. There's loads of interesting, if you're interested, there's loads of interesting files in the National Archives about discussions from the companies to government departments, particularly sort of with the Free State and about trying to change trying to manage the new legislation of the Free State. Okay, so I'm going to kind of tell the story a little bit with kind of starting with sort of bringing you into the world of insurance, bringing you into the world of 18th century Dublin, and how insurance kind of developed a little bit. So, a little bit on maritime insurance. So, in Dublin, we have a great story about the Ouzel Gallery. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this little plaque that's on Dame Street. So, the story goes anyway that in the 1690s, a merchant galley ship called the Ouzel set sail from Ringsend. It was due to sail through the Mediterranean over to the Levant, over to kind of the far side of the Mediterranean, kind of Syria region. In the Mediterranean, the ship was captured by pirates. The crew and the contents were presumed gone, and then the insurance claim on the ship was paid. But about a decade later, the ship returned with its crew and a whole shipload of new goods, which were pirate booty. Now, this led to the insurance claim being contested, counter-contested, and for many, 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 many years, very expensive legal wrangling went on. Eventually, an arbitration body was set up called the Ouzel Galley Society. Now, this has kind of been discounted, but it was popularly believed for a long time that this was the forerunner of the Dublin Chamber of Commerce. That has kind of been discounted now. Now, this plaque used to be on Dame Street on the front of what were the commercial buildings. And I'll be talking about the commercial buildings again. If you're walking down Dame Street, about halfway down, the plaque was actually on the front. It has now been moved to the back of that building. So if you're standing at where the central bank was, if you just look up, it's kind of in a little corner, basically what's that donut shop on the corner, Krispy Kreme? Yeah, so if you're standing basically at the door of Krispy Kreme, if you just look up to your left, this little plaque is now tucked away up in the corner. Now, the fable of the Ouzel may not be rooted in documentary evidence. There's a lot about it that's contested, but the details of the contested insurance payout are a window into the predominant insurance category of the late 16th and early 17th century into 18th century, and that's maritime insurance. The so-called age of exploration, the centuries from the 15th to the 17th, during which European countries set sail to areas beyond their own borders, led then to an age of colonization, with a corresponding increase in maritime travel and trade. From the bustling coffee houses then of London, the first major maritime insurer, Lloyd's of London, emerged. Now, this period, if you know Dublin history as well, we're saying, why is she telling us all this? We know all this. I want to repeat some of this, even though a lot of this is probably quite familiar to you. And it's because when I was doing this research, I knew quite a lot of kind of the Dublin history, but actually doing the research into the insurance kind of made me think about that history in a different way. And it made me think about, certainly 19th century Dublin, it made me think about it in a different way, which is what I'd like to kind of bring you into a little bit today. So here we have a slide from John Rock's 1756 map of the Customs House Quay, which of course is down now in the middle of Temple Bar. Dublin's commercial centre and the destination of many of the ships entering the city would have been the area now known as Temple Bar West, the site of the original Customs House. So the Customs House, separated from town, was Grattan Bridge. The old Customs House was built in 1707, and before it was eventually demolished, was used as a barracks when the new Customs House was built, which as we know is still the Customs House further down on the quays. Another little view from John Rock. Here's a little glimpse of the River Liffey in the 18th century. Now, as the quaysides along the Liffey were gradually built up, and as more bridges were built across the river, and the Customs House was relocated down from Temple Bar to the port, this scene here would eventually become unfamiliar to Dubliners. But I want to share it kind of as a reminder as to why maritime insurance was such a big deal. Because this is what the Liffey would look like. And when I'm talking about kind of Dublin, the history of Dublin, I always say to people, go and have a look at Rock's map. Because I think often we forget the size of the Liffey and the importance of the Liffey to the city of Dublin. Like, it's the reason that the city exists. But because it has been reclaimed over, the last 1,000 years, and is so much smaller now than it would have been even a few hundred years ago, I think we kind of forget how integral the Liffey would have been to the development of Dublin and the kind of commercial trade that would have been on it. And when you've all these ships coming in and out, this is why maritime insurance was so important. Now, throughout the 18th century then, the administrative structure of Dublin's port was expanded, as was its physical structure. This is in keeping with Dublin's reputation as the second city of the empire in the 18th century. A city of Georgian mansions, new pleasure gardens, new industry brought by the Quaker and Huguenot settlers. St. Stephen's Green was, and I quote from Colm Lennon and John Montague, a popular promenading ground for the beau monde and being compared favourably to St. James's Park in London. The Liberties area was the manufacturing district of the 18th century, particularly in relation to weaving, reflected in names like Weaver Square and tenters. So tenters being the woven cloths that were stretched out, dried on frames that were held by tenter hooks. If anyone remembers the Tenters pub up in Grey Pub. Given the proclivity of fires in their factories, the linen and cotton industries were also a very good source of custom for the fire insurance industries. That's just a little extract again from Rock of Weaver Square. So here, courtesy of the Friends Historical Library, and I know it's very, very detailed as some of the writings are, so I'm just to kind of give you an overall view of it. But this is a fire insurance policy that was taken out by a John Grubb in Clonmel. Now the Grubb family, I'm originally from Carrick-on-Suir in County Tipperary, and the Grubbs were a big family, big Quaker family down in Tipperary and Waterford. They first arrived in Waterford around the end of the 17th century, I think, but they were very prominent in Carrick, in Clonmel, that kind of part of Tipperary. They were very involved in milling. Now, the other thing about the Quakers is that they were a very good example of how the insurance industry in the kind of particularly the 19th century, recruited agents, because the Quakers were very well established as business people, and new insurance companies wanted agents, but they wanted agents who were already established as business people. So you actually see a lot of Quakers throughout Ireland being involved in kind of new insurance companies. And if you think about it, if you remember back, anyone who's from kind of small town Ireland probably would particularly remember, if you remember back, say, in the 80s, the local insurance agent usually had another job. They usually had like 2 or 3 kind of jobs. It might be the local funeral director, it might be the local, fire insurance agent. So they generally had kind of a couple of positions. Now, the Act of Union in 1800 marked a huge change in Irish politics and Dublin as a capital city. The French Revolution of the 1790s was a source of inspiration to Irish Republicans like Theobald Wolfe Tone and a point of concern for Westminster. The sympathies between the two countries became clear when a French fleet sailed to Ireland to support an uprising. Although a storm thwarted efforts to land off the Irish coast, and the subsequent rebellion in 1798 was successfully quashed by the Lord Lieutenant and his forces, the government in Westminster was unnerved. It decided that Ireland needed to be ruled directly rather than through what they considered an increasingly unreliant parliament in Dublin. In 1800 then, the Irish Parliament voted itself out of existence. The Act of Union created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, disbanded the Irish Parliament, so Irish members of Parliament then had to sit in Westminster and represent Ireland. 1801, the Act came into force, and in 1803, the Parliament building was bought by the Bank of Ireland. Now, this brings a huge change to the city. One of the best physical examples of this change can be seen in Henrietta Street, just north of the Liffey. One of the foremost fashionable streets for the wealthy of Dublin. It was developed by Luke Gardner, and its large and impressive houses were the town residence of merchants, government officials, and men like Sir Robert King, who was, and I quote from Melanie Hayes, he died in 1755 at the age of 31, leaving ruined reputations, illegitimate offspring, and colossal debts in his wake. Now, the flight of the professional classes out of Dublin following the Act of Union highlighted the lack of industrialisation in the city. Once the employment they had brought was gone, there was nothing of significance to replace it, which meant that most workers lived on an exceptionally slim budget, seeking out the cheapest possible accommodation. In many instances, the cheapest were the tenements, the now deteriorating Georgian mansions, abandoned by the professional classes in the aftermath of the closure of the Irish Parliament. This is a really, really famous picture of Henrietta Street. You know, you can see, looking at it, if you've never seen it before, it has a real cinematic quality because you have the contrast, you know, the fading house in the background, all of the kids, and this fabulous girl in the middle who draws your eyes in. Tenement life was a feature in Dublin's history until the mid-20th century. In 1913, I quote from Timothy Murty here, again on Henrietta Street, in 1913, 68,000 Dubliners resided in one-roomed tenement accommodation. Yet by 1926, this had actually risen to 78,000. And as you probably know, the tenement history is kind of well documented in the museum in 14 Henrietta Street. Now, before I started this research, you know, this was all known to me. I'm sure most of you know all of this really well as well. The story of the decline of George in Dublin is so visual and so kind of still present in our city that for the casual observer, it kind of dominates our view of 19th century Dublin. It was only really kind of when I threw myself into the insurance aspect of 19th century Dublin that I realised that along with this decline, which is really well documented, there was actually a new type of industry emerging and a new professional class in Dublin. So our traditional view has always been that, you know, East Ulster, Belfast was the real industrialised part of Ireland, and it's the real powerhouse, and that Dublin, the rest of Ireland, is really far behind, and it's, you know, it's agricultural, and we were so over-reliant on agricultural products. And I think actually that has been a little bit oversimplified. So the Dublin then of Christopher Eiffe was a kind of a city of contradictions. Although a financial drain from the city was caused by the closure of the Parliament, the famine, lack of industrialisation, and the flight of the middle classes to the new suburbs, Dublin, and particularly Dame Street, developed throughout the 19th century into a banking and insurance hub. Possibly or probably influenced by the proximity to the new Bank of Ireland, many new financial and insurance businesses established themselves in the Dame Street Temple Bar area. Now we're going to take a little aside into Dame Street. And again, this is just to kind of, we're narrowing down all the time to get closer and closer to Caledonian. So Dame Street. Dame Street today is a busy and bustling thoroughfare through the city centre. And many of the ground floors of these 17th and 18th century buildings are, you know, they're modern shops, restaurant, offices. But a glance upwards can reveal hundreds of years of history still visible in stone. And it's one of my, I'm big into Dame Street. I think Dame Street is a very underrated street. So this is my push to try and kind of get you all into being fans of Dame Street. Dame Street began as Dam Street, or earlier, occasionally some variation of the Thingmouth Street. The Thingmount was a Viking assembly. There's a bit of dispute over where it exactly was, possibly down kind of where Suffolk Street is. The Thing is a term for a Scandinavian assembly area. The dam was on the River Poddle, then an overground invisible river by the eastern city gate of the medieval city, which is roughly where, if you see at the bottom here, where the water is here, this would now be part of the castle grounds. So this is the Poddle here. So this area here is now where the castle garden is in the back of the castle. So this then brings you into, say, Cork Hill, where, what's there, City Hall. And then if you go down this way, you're down into what would be now Parliament Street. So these are the dams on the eastern city gate here, and this square, well, rectangle shape here, this is Dublin Castle. When Trinity College opened its doors in 1592, its location was considered to be outside the city of Dublin because Trinity was the other end of Dame Street. It was built on the site of the then closed All Hallows Monastery. Dame Street's importance as a thoroughfare was then perhaps always related to its proximity to officialdom. So there's the Viking Thing, there's Trinity College and the Irish Parliament at one end, and then on the other end you have Dublin Castle and the medieval walled town. Now, in the final years of the 18th century, the commissioners for making wide and convenient ways, streets and passages in the city of Dublin was established. More commonly referred to as the Wide Streets Commission, much of the modern city centre owes its shape to the actions of the Wide Street Commissions and their efforts to make the medieval city streets more suitable for the changing needs of the early modern city. Like a lot of cities throughout Europe, in Dublin they stopped preserving those big old, medieval stone walls, and plus the type of defence that a city needs has changed from those medieval needs. So it's in June 1834 then that this old medieval thoroughfare, widened and expanded throughout the 18th century, became home to Caledonian and many of its insurance rivals. The company's first Dame Street address was number 51. Its neighbours were notaries, stockbrokers, goldsmiths, all sorts of different companies. So this again is just to bring you into kind of the visual, these are all very familiar pictures, into kind of the visual of what the street sort of would have looked like as we're coming into when Caledonian came here. So here we view obviously what was the old Parliament building. Now this is obviously you're standing with Trinity at your back and you're looking down. So this is only 20 years before Caledonian arrived in Dublin. So this is roughly the Dame Street that they would have been looking at. Now, a little bit further down, if I can go back, sorry. So about halfway down, I mentioned the commercial buildings. So just down on this block here, we're looking at the commercial buildings. So it's saying, companies came to Dame Street because you've got something like the Bank of Ireland, you're close to Dublin Castle, you've got Trinity College. But halfway down then you have the commercial buildings. And these were remodeled, kind of moved and remodeled with the construction of the central bank in the 1970s. But the commercial buildings, what I found really, really interesting was this description of the commercial buildings. And I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but basically they were a place for kind of merchants to meet. So kind of the idea of the city, what the city hall originally had been, that it was a place for merchants to meet. So you have a coffee room well supplied with domestic and foreign papers, tables of imports and exports, and every species of mercantile advertisements. The middle story is appropriated as a hotel for the accommodation of foreign merchants, or indeed of any respectable persons who prefer this part of town for a temporary residence. So I'm telling you this to get the idea that you're coming into Dame Street, that you have this real hub of merchant activity. Merchants are coming in and meeting each other here. There's foreign merchants coming in. There's newspapers. People are well informed. The other thing that, just as an aside, I found really interesting was that in the former central bank, there was now, I'm not sure 100% if it's still there, there was a new company there called WeWork. They're like a shared office space company. But I was looking up their website and the description of what they provide is very, very like what the commercial building was providing. It was like, you come in, you'll have a desk, you can meet people if you want to, you can have a coffee, you can sit down, now they have Wi-Fi as opposed to, newspapers. But I just thought there was a nice kind of symmetry in the fact that sort of almost on the same spot, you now have the same kind of services being provided. Okay, so Dame Street then. In the 1860s, the company, Caledonian, constructed its own buildings at number 31 Dame Street at a cost of £6,000. It was designed by James Rogers, a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, and the architectural practice of Dean and Woodward, who were responsible for the Trinity Museum in the 1850s. Now, one of the things about Dame Street is, you know, you're walking along, there's all this stuff on the ground floor. When and if it's safe to do so, look up as you're walking along the street, because I had passed this lots and lots and lots of times. And everyone in Caledonian, so Royal London Ireland is now, they've gone through all, Caledonian went through all different amalgamations, you know. And I, when I was doing the research and I found out that they had built this building originally, and I said to them, did you guys know that you had owned this building, you had built this building? Nobody knew. And pretty much everyone in the company has passed that building hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And all the symbol, I know it's a little bit hard to see in these photos, but all the symbolism, the Caledonian company symbolism is built into that building. Rogers, this was, and I quote from the Dictionary of Irish Architects, Rogers' only known commercial building in Dublin was the Caledonian Insurance Company's offices, 31 Dame Street, opened in 1866. Its facade must rank as one of the best examples of Victorian street architecture in the city. The elevation is faced principally with red brick, with limestone string courses and richly carved voussoirs. Am I saying that right? Voussoirs. So I had to look this up. I didn't know what a voussoir. A voussoir, for anyone else who doesn't know, is kind of a wedge-shaped brick that when you're putting an arch, the bricks are always wedge-shaped, basically, to make the arch safe. And richly carved voussoirs of a more abstract design than is usual in Dublin. Polished shafts of pink granite and a pink marble band contrast with the limestone of the ground floor. So not only did this new Scottish company in Ireland build a building for themselves, they built one that actually was really, what would you say, was considered, you know, by architectural standards was considered very attractive. Completely kind of nothing to do with this, but this was across the street, it's still there. I love, love, love this building. And I love it because this elevation, these windows that go up, and again, I hadn't realized that this had also began life as an insurance company building. This was the Crown Insurance Company, yeah. And again, it's just to kind of say we pass all these buildings every day, and that, you know, you don't realize sort of the richness of the history that's in the building. Okay, so before we get to Christopher Eiffe then, just a kind of a quick recap. So insurance world, 18th century, we're looking at maritime insurance. We're looking at Dublin changing as a city that, you know, it was really focused on the river. Temple Bar is the commercial centre, then with the new Customs House, that moves down to the port, and as we know, Temple Bar kind of lost a bit of its vitality. Dublin in the 19th century, yes, there was definitely a decline, but there was also a rise in new industry coming in, a different type of industry, which I really think of Dame Street at this time as kind of the financial services centre, the centre, you know, area of 19th century Dublin. We looked at the evolution of Dame Street, this really important thoroughfare, which has always had a kind of an access to officialdom in Dublin. Now, I'm going to bring you into Christopher Eiffe, and we're going to look at sort of the rise of the new professional class. But again, I'm going to just take a tiny little aside for a moment, if you'll permit me. Because when I was doing the research initially, I came across this magazine journal publication called Titbits. Now, Titbits was founded in 1881 by a guy called George, is Nunes or Nunez? Again, I've never heard anyone pronounce his name, so I'm going to say Nunez. And Titbits was, it had, you know, you could contribute articles to it, you know, you could send in a story and all this kind of stuff. George was a very entrepreneurial type of character, and he came up with a new marketing idea. And that marketing idea was that £100 will be paid by the proprietor of Titbits to the next of kin of any person who was killed in a railway accident, provided a copy of the current issue of Titbits is found upon the deceased at the time of the catastrophe. And if you see from this one, I can't remember what date, if I look at this, is this 1904, this, and you can see along the side here, it says, Titbits has paid £15,300 in insurance money. So they have paid out to people who were very unfortunately found deceased at the side of a railway track, but they had the current copy of Titbits on them. And I mean, there's a lot, you know, there's a whole aside you can go into on that, on kind of the importance of, you know, the railway, at the time, and the use of the railway and all that kind of stuff. Now, when I was putting together the talk today, I couldn't remember what year it had been founded. I hadn't written it down. So I thought I'll just go in and have a quick look and see the year that Titbits had been founded. And by pure chance I came, and again, this is just permit me to kind of go off topic a little bit here. I found this great article by Frank McNally. And Frank McNally, everything that Frank McNally writes is so good. But it's an article about Tommaso Cleric and this particular photograph. His name over the door is in Irish Gaelic script. The sign alongside him advertises the Irish Freedom, a militant newspaper run by fellow conspirators in the IRB, which used his premises as a meeting place and communications exchange. But, says Frank, the effect is spoiled a little bit by the sign's other prominent ad for Titbits magazine, the popular English weekly that delivered light entertainment for the masses. He says, while waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, clearly even revolutionary newsagents had to make a living. Now, again, we're going to skip a little bit of that, but it brings us back into Ulysses as well. This is along with hoovering up amusing or sensational snippets from other journals around the world. Titbits formerly included publishing original short stories. And its weekly prize Titbit paid very well, perhaps to the envy of Joyce, even if the form was beneath him. So in episode 2 of Ulysses, when Leopold Bloom needs some reading material to accompany him on an important mission, that's to the outdoor toilet at the rear of 7 Eccles Street, he reaches for an old copy of the magazine, in which the prize story is by one Philip Beaufoy of London. Now, Beaufoy was a real-life contributor who won regularly, and in enjoying his latest offering, Matcham's Masterstroke, Bloom also marvels at the prize, £3.13 6, while wondering if he could concoct such a story himself. He notes the importance of the plot having a moral conclusion, but his visit to the bathroom ends with him tearing out the prize story, or half of it. Then, in what may be Joyce's moral, Bloom uses the page for purposes other than entertainment. Okay, and the other thing about insurance companies, so while there's also a little bit of, what would you say, kind of wild marketing that we see with Titbits, the other thing to remember is that there was a huge amount of companies. So, you know, we look at, you know, I'm going to be talking about a company which still exists today, but there was a huge amount of small companies that were set up over the years, and I just really liked this particular kind of cartoon, which sort of exemplifies in one image all of those who have gone before them, basically. Okay, so having talked a lot about him, let's get to Christopher. So we first find Christopher Eiffe as a coal merchant. Now, he had been in the coal business since at least 1819. That's the earliest kind of date that I can kind of really connect him with it. Now, the environmental impact of coal has, as we know, led to successive legislation throughout the late 20th, early 21st century, reducing its use, and many households today will never have used coal. It was, however, the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, and a coal merchant like Eiffe would have had extensive knowledge of experience dealing with the public, soliciting for business, and negotiating with the logistics of English colliers. Now, despite the infamous and perhaps incorrectly attributed quip by Jonathan Swift, Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, that Irish people should, and I quote, burn everything English except their people and coal, Ireland was actually very reliant on English coal. I quote here from O. McGuinness, Dublin had an insatiable appetite for coal as it was the main domestic fuel and key to expanding industries such as breweries. The demand continued to expand in the 19th century when the Dublin Gas Company became a huge customer for coal in order to provide gas light for Dublin from its gasworks on Hanover Quay. Now, there's no way to know what prompted Christopher's move into insurance, perhaps personal ambition, which insurance was an industry which was kind of really growing at the time, so perhaps it was just personal ambition. Now, in the same month, so this is him announcing that he's leaving the coal merchant. In the same month as announcing that he's leaving the coal industry, an announcement, appears in the Freeman's Journal for the Royal Irish Assurance Company, in which Christopher Eiffe is named as the company actuary. Now, he's gone from being, 1 year he's a coal merchant and the next year he's now an actuary for an insurance company. Based on common practice in the 1820s, there's probably a higher probability that Eiffe was recruited into the insurance industry for his existing business management experience rather than his acquisition of a relevant degree. What would the workload of an early 19th century actuary compare to that of their 21st century counterpart? And I quote here, neither the actuary's title nor duties would stabilise until after the third decade of the 19th century. And significant diversity in form and function remained long after that, compared with later in the century. The typical actuary prior to 1840 was expected to perform a broad combination of managerial, clerical and mathematical tasks with an extra burden of providing new premium tables in the case of startup firms. Now, as you can see, Christopher fit into all of these boxes. He was a well-established businessman. He would have been dealing with, imports and exports, dealing with, finances. Now, he seems to have stayed with the Royal Irish Assurance Company until 1827, at which point the RIA was dissolved, went into the insurance graveyard, and Eiffe began to represent a company called Phoenix Fire and Asylum Life. He was also living at number 54 York Street. I'd go back to that. So 54 York Street was listed as his address for quite a while. Now, York Street was a very, a very well-to-do street in the 19th century. So you can see even the list of his neighbours. Now remember that it's at the, it's on the street of the Royal College of Surgeons. So there's a lot of surgeons, there's a lot of doctors, but there was also lots of legal people, and then you have Christopher Eiffe as well. So he is announced as the new company director. The company introduced themselves into Ireland. Now this this is very, very difficult to read, so I'll just explain what it is basically. When the company started, their first address is listed as, I think it's 44 Dame Street, which kind of cheekily was actually the company that Christopher had just stopped working for. They were basically kind of just still using the number. But actually what they say then once they kind of get up and running is they're like, look, Christopher is going to use his home address for the moment. So can you please just direct all your messages to 54 York Street for the moment? So he's kind of an early proponent of, the work from home principle, because really they had no offices. We find then in what year is this? 1835. Then they finally moved to number 51 Dame Street. So these are just examples of, I found this really interesting. These kind of advertisements were new to me. But I really liked that the advertisements for the companies are kind of a mixture between sort of official pronouncements, and they tell you who the company directors are and all of that kind of stuff. Then on the other side, often they're giving you a list of their agents throughout the country, which actually was quite impressive how quickly they got agents throughout the rest of Ireland. But they also are great for putting in these little bits where they say the directors, in presenting to their friends, the Irish public, the proposals and conditions of the Caledonian Company, return thanks for the great support given them and feel bound to express their gratitude for the confidence reposed in them. They continue offer to follow the wording, topics, and all the rest. But they're great for saying, here's all the kind of official stuff, and then we're just going to throw in, you know, the Irish people have been great, you're wonderful, thanks so much for all the support that you've given us, you know, keep it coming. This then is an example just of, again, you know, this is 2 years later after they came to Ireland, all the agents that they have throughout the country. And I would wager, like, a lot of these are already business people. So you see there's, you know, people in post office, there's few people in post office, bank, stamp office, banks. So people wine merchants, so people who are already in business. And then they often have at the end, you see, respectable individuals willing to become agents in the following towns may communicate with the manager. So there's my own hometown in there, which is what caught my eye for this ad. But you can apply then to the manager to become an agent in your town. Now, while his social status might have been on the rise, Eiffe did more with his influence than simply enjoy the benefits of his position. He was also an active member of Dublin's political and philanthropic community. Oh, this is just another list of, this is one of those kind of sneaky ads where they're like, we're, you know, going to advertise our company, but we're going to do it by listing all of these people who tell us we're wonderful. So these are all little kind of snippets of people saying, yes, Christopher Eiffe was so wonderful. He paid out our money when, you know, we had a dreadful fire and it was really awful, and he paid us really quickly on time. Thank you so much. So it's like a kind of a condensed version of all the thank you letters that, you know, he's gotten from happy customers. But it's a very clever way of marketing. So Christopher, this fundraiser for the Coombe Lying-in Hospital, which was a relatively recent foundation at the time. Mortality rates for women and their babies in Dublin was very high, and realistically was kind of relieved only very slightly by your social status. Now, I know from going through the records that Christopher had at least 2 children. He had a daughter called Eliza Matilda and a son, Charles. And it's possible that it might have been his immediate experience of childbirth, or if there had been, you know, perhaps other children, which prompted his desire to get involved in a new organisation like this and support it. Eliza Matilda had been born in 1817, and I know that she died in 1865. In 1844, she married a man called James Milo Burke in St Andrew's Church on Westland Row. James was a barrister who had been part of Daniel O'Connell's defence team during the 1844 trial. Christopher's son, Charles Eiffe, died in 1865, also on his way to India. He was a ship captain. Now, I have the newspaper out, but it's really, really difficult to read, so there's no point in putting that up. Now, I was going through then, so I found, you know, lots of Christopher Eiffe in kind of newspapers and things like that. So I was building up this picture. He was involved in philanthropy. He was part of the city. But one of the things that I loved most that I found was his signature. And it's so difficult to find sort of personal examples of somebody. And not only did he have a signature, what a signature. I mean, that's a great flourish. So this was part of, this was a signature on a letter that was written from his position as the secretary to the Board of Health for St Andrew's Parish. Sorry, let me go back to here. So it was from his position as secretary to the Board of Health for St Andrew's Parish. So the National Archives hold this letter, and it was written to Sir William Gossett, the Under Secretary for Ireland at the time. And the correspondence is signed by 45 householders of St Andrew's Parish, the Board of Health for St Andrew's Parish, requesting that nuisances, including brothels and night houses, be removed from St Andrew's Lane, and that a policeman be stationed in the area to prevent the discharge of waste onto that public street, warning that such filth encourages the spread of disease, including cholera. So, you know, people were looking for policemen in whatever it was, what year was they're still looking for more policemen on the street. So, you know, it's one of those, some things never change. But I was so thrilled when I came across this, because it's just such a lovely example of sort of the personal reflection of somebody. Now, in his political leanings, he was a man of repeal, a supporter of Daniel O'Connell, who was fittingly Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1841. His support of O'Connell, however, can be traced all the way back to the 1820s, and this support was a practical one, as were his other forms of political involvement. There's numerous newspaper notices over the years during which Eiffe is involved in kind of trying to encourage the public to contribute money to Daniel O'Connell's cause. So when he gets involved in a cause, he really gets involved in it. Like he's the committee member for everything. You know, he goes to the meetings and all the rest. Now, for all his philanthropy and good works, Christopher was not a man to let a slight on his name pass uncorrected. Beginning in 1837 and weaving its way through the courts and the newspapers was a dispute that Eiffe had with a man named Ebenezer Jacob. Now, this went on for years and years and years, and there's a million bits of newspapers about it. And I'm just going to read a tiny little bit from the start of the court proceedings. Now, when it came out of the newspaper, it was this small. It's very hard to read, so I'm not going to put it up. So I blew a little bit of it up. But again, it's just to give you an idea of kind of the concerns of the professional classes in the 19th century. So Mr. Napier opened the pleadings. This was an action of scandal, and the defendant had pleaded the general issue. The words charged to have been used by the defendant were, "I charge him with having robbed the chest of a Masonic lodge, with having swindled an insurance company, and with more than that, namely, having been horsewhipped in his own office by Mr. Gahan. Damages were laid at £500. Mr. Blake QC stated the case. He appeared for the plaintiff, who complained of one of the greatest injuries that one man could inflict upon another. The plaintiff, Mr. Eiffe, is the manager in Ireland of a highly respectable insurance company. And Mr. Jacob is a gentleman of rank and station, possessed of a very considerable estates in the south of Ireland, and had formerly been a member of Parliament for the borough of Dungarvan." And basically, they meet each other. There's all this. One of them comes to one other person's house, and then somebody says something which the other person doesn't like, and then there's all Chinese whispers, and it's all talked about all over Dublin, and then they publish letters in the newspapers to say, "I'm sorry," and then that sorry is refuted, and then it goes back to court, and this goes on for years and years and years. In 1842, Christopher Eiffe's time as a manager for Caledonian came to an end. His financial career continued, however, which we learn partly from another court case, which again was in defence of his good name. And again, this is in 1846, and I'll just read a slight little bit of it. Mr. Christopher Eiffe, late an insurance agent in Dublin and now a stockbroker in London, brought an action for slander against Mr. Barton, a law student in the Court of Queen's Bench on Friday, and obtained a verdict. Damages, 1 farthing. The slander consisted in the defendant, who had previously been grossly insulted by the plaintiff, stating that Mr. Eiffe had been expelled from a Masonic lodge in Dublin for stealing silver spoons. Dreadful stuff. Now, from his son's death notice on the ship on the way to India in 1845, that death notice refers to Christopher Eiffe as the late Christopher Eiffe. So we know that by 1865 he has passed away. Now, on to our final bit. We're nearly there. Let's get on to the fire bit. Now, in 1862, Dublin Fire Brigade was established in Dublin, the first municipal brigade. For a city whose foundations were wooden revetments, the revetments are kind of a retaining wall, basically. For a city which was essentially built on wood, organised fire management was very surprisingly absent. In the early medieval period, being responsible for a fire could cost you your pocket or your life. A citizen of medieval Dublin would have done well to be aware of the ordinances of the Common Council of the City of Dublin, which stated, for fire, taking place in any house from which flames issue not, the householder, after the fire has been extinguished is liable to a fine of 20 shillings. If the flames be visible externally, the fine is 40 shillings. Any person answerable for the burning of a street shall be arrested, cast into the middle of the fire, or pay 100 shillings. You pick which way you want to go. So here, in this slide, we have an example of two 18th century fire engines. So 18th century fire management was organised throughout what was called the parish pump system, whereby each parish, which at the time, because it was the established church, was the Church of Ireland, these parishes would provide a water pump in the case of fire. So we've two of these up in St. Werburgh's. So Elizabeth went in and took pictures of them very kindly for me. And it's from these pumps that we get the phrase parish pump politics. Essentially, which means it's something very parochial. It's organised very, very locally and parochial. But also there was a lot of disagreement between different parishes as to which of them had attended the fire first, because the payment was made on a sliding scale depending on the order of attendance at the fire. So, for instance, each parish where a fire occurred made a payment to the first, second and third fire engine to arrive at the fire rather than the application of water to it. Poorer parishes often cut back on maintenance of the engine, as the requirement was to attend the fire in their own parish or adjoining one, not to play an effective part in extinguishing it. And that's a quote from Laz. Now, if you look at these, essentially these were, they were essentially fairly useless. You had to operate it, you had to have somebody up on top of it, okay? And it was a pump. You pumped the water through it. One of the problems with that is that, I don't know how physically fit you have to be to keep pumping water, but it's a pretty tiring exercise, okay? The second thing is that the actual projection of water, there's probably a better term for it, but you know what I mean, the spout, yeah, basically the angle of the water is not very far. So, which means that you've to kind of be in the middle of the fire to actually get any water onto the fire. So you can kind of see why they were a little bit reluctant to, turn up, or actually get into managing the fire. It was an inefficient system, and into the breach stepped the insurance companies. If you don't want to pay payouts for fire, you go and you put out the fire yourself, basically was the system they operated. The other thing as well is that various breweries throughout the city also had fire engines. During the Easter Rising in April 1916, the fire brigades from the Guinness Brewery and the Powers Distillery up on Thomas Street both assisted the Dublin Fire Brigade in putting out fires throughout the city. The Guinness Fire Brigade and Rescue Service still has a small service up in St. James's Gate today. Equipping a fire engine with tools and men might seem like a large burden for the insurance industry, but in the absence of an organised central fire management system, putting out the fires yourself is a prudent way to avoid payouts, basically. Now, they did help, they did come together, so they weren't just sort of looking out for their own payouts. They actually did operate quite a bit as municipal services. So here we have a little newspaper notice which talks about a fire up in the Meath Hospital. And it mentions Mr. Eiffe, the engine of the Caledonian Company. There's the Sun, the National, the Royal Exchange, and the Sun Company. So there was a few companies came together up to the Meath Hospital to help put out the fire. Now, the report into the fire mentions that it did believe that there was insurance on the building. Now, at a time when literacy, wouldn't have been uniform across the masses, and the 19th century tenement dwellers might have had very little contact with the owner of their building. So who's in charge of who knows who to contact and all of that kind of stuff. That's where you get the fire marks. So the fire marks, and I quote here from Pat Johnson, "These marks were first made of lead and from 1820 of tin, copper and iron. They advertised the insurance company. They served as identifications before the days of house numbering. And under some company regulations, a policy was not in force until a mark was affixed. So basically, if you got a fire insurance policy from a company, you would get your fire mark. Some of them have the policy number stamped into the bottom under the ribbon. Each company had their own distinctive style. So the one that kind of always stands out the most to me is the Sun Fire Insurance Company, because they had a smiling sun face in the middle of their fire mark. So these are two from Caledonian. So obviously they had the thistle, which is the kind of the Scottish symbol. Now, this again was news to the company that, you know, like I hadn't known about fire marks. And again, these are Laz's photos that he shared with me. So I went kind of looking up, God, I wonder, could you get a fire mark now? Where are they? And of course, like everything, there's somebody that collects every single thing in the world. So I came across a group in England who are Fire Mark Circle. They basically collect and auction them and all of that kind of stuff. Now, considering that there would have been an awful lot of these fire marks, there actually isn't that many really, you know, of them surviving. But I got in contact with them and I said, God, do you ever, you know, this is what I'm doing, this research, do you ever come across the Caledonian ones? And he went, yeah, absolutely, they do turn up. And I said, any chance you'd bid for me? Because it's kind of a close, you have to be a member. And I was like, don't really need to join, but can you bid for me? And very, very kindly, a gentleman called Russell, he said, yeah, absolutely. Got in contact with me a few months later and said, there's one coming up in our next auction, give me your max and I'll bid for you. And we got it. So we have, it looks like this one. So we won the auction basically and he posted over. They're about the size of a pencil. So they're kind of about that size. I imagine they would be much bigger, but they're about the size of a pencil. So it was great that kind of the company now have one of their old fire marks back. There was, oh yeah, no, that's an aside. I won't go into that. Anyway, I'll move on, sorry. So the fire engine. Now, whatever fire engine Christopher Eiffe had at his disposal when he took over as manager of Caledonian clearly wasn't enough. Because in 1839, he advertised for a whole new fire brigade, an engine, captain, and 12 able-bodied men. Now, he was an early proponent of supporting Irish-made goods. He specified that his preference was for an engine of Irish manufacture. So if you see the small little, oh, that's very loud, sorry, the small little bit down the right, a decided preference will be given to Irish manufacture and to obtain the best. Mr. Eiffe does not pledge himself to accept the lowest tender. So don't think that coming in cheap means you're going to win the tender. It's got to be Irish and it's got to be good. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's a really impressive, very, very, very detailed list of what the fire engine is supposed to look like and what it's supposed to be. And they were, all of the company fire engines were, I mean, they must have looked really impressive because they were all uniformed. I mean, these guys were, this was a real proper job. They were like, what's the term, liveried? So they had their own, you know, company uniforms. So, I mean, they must have looked very, very impressive. So this is the engine lettered in gold, all the tools, you know, the fire axe, crowbar, fire hook, fire ladder. So this was a serious, you know, a serious job. Now, the last bit then, let's say you've equipped yourself with an impressive new fire engine and you have all of your policies publicly noted with the fire mark. Is there anything else you can do as an insurance company to protect yourself and manage the fire business that you have? What might help is a detailed map of the city showing a breakdown of each building and the materials used and stored in each building. And this brings us to a gentleman called Charles Goad. Now, Goad was an English engineer who moved to Canada in the 1860s. He was involved in kind of the new railroad industry. And he spotted an opportunity to provide extremely detailed street maps, specifically designed to show fire hazards and dangers, exactly the type of information an insurance company would love to have when they're setting premiums. So here is Goad's Dublin map. Now you can find these online and they're brilliant because you can zoom in on the different streets. So this is the overall map. This is just a little example of kind of when you zoom in. So here's the Wicklow Hotel. So here's Grafton Street. So this is obviously Wicklow Street down here. This is the corner here where Weir's would be today, this building here. But you can see the kind of detail that's in it. It's color coded, so you have all of the different, you know, what the buildings are made of. You have the wall type. Oh, actually, that cut it off a little bit. So the little dots, you know, they're really, really detailed. So the little dots show what kind of a wall, load bearing, big, small, or whatever. And they're brilliant. I mean, you literally go online and have a look at these. I included this because I liked that the Wicklow Hotel had admission refused. Because these maps, the insurance companies would hire these maps from Charles Goad's company. So if you're a business and you come in and you say, I want to get fire insurance, they could hire the map from Goad and say, right, this is the building you're in. Okay, you're in a wooden building that's full of like firecrackers. Let's have a look at what your premium's going to be. It's probably not going to be too great. I know that with the Wicklow, with the admission refused, sometimes that caused difficulties when people went to get their get their insurance premiums. So I think sometimes there are updates on these maps. There was like retrospective, like, oh, maybe we will let you come in actually because our insurance premium probably will be cheaper if we let you come in. But these are fabulous, and again, these were new to me. I hadn't ever heard of Charles Goad and these maps before, and they are available. You can look them up online and go through them. Okay, so let's finally come to an end. I was trying to think about kind of what conclusion to bring to Christopher Eiffe, to kind of the insurance company. And I know I've had quite a disparate talk. I've covered lots and lots of different things. And kind of as a conclusion, I'm kind of going to leave it sort of open-ended. When I was doing my PhD, a whole section of it was about what's called prosopography. So prosopography is the study of what we might call like ordinary people. So people that are hard to find in records. Now, it's quite common if people studying Roman and Greek history using, using kind of burial inscriptions, say, oh, well, we're going to get the names of people and kind of the years that they were alive and that kind of stuff. And you try and build up a picture of a community through that. For medieval history, you know, it can be quite difficult because of the kind of records that we have and all of that kind of stuff. But it really kind of struck me when I was, you know, looking at Christopher's life, and you know, there's more about him than what I presented today. That there's so many stories like this, these small little insights into what we call kind of ordinary people. Now, I know, you know, he was richer than the average Dubliner in the 19th century. He lived in a very nice street. He was the director of a company. You know, I'm aware there are slightly differences, but you know, we're looking at the new Netflix drama with the Guinnesses, and it's all, you know, the money and all of this kind of stuff. There's lots of stories of that time period that are there. You know, it wasn't that difficult to find out this information about him, just going through the Dublin directories and stuff like that. So I'd like to think there's lots more stories out there that can kind of, you know, come to life. And I was really, really thrilled. I mean, I was delighted to get the opportunity to look at Christopher and look at insurance. And again, you know, all of the kind of fire insurance stuff was certainly new to me, and it was new to the company. But just there's a lot more stories out there about 19th century Dublin, which I think show it in perhaps a more positive light than certainly I had been as a person who's, you know, it's not my specialist area. But I think the decline of Dublin in the 19th century has been a little bit overdone in a way. I think there is a quieter story of kind of success and exciting things happening in 19th century Dublin there. Thank you all very much for coming.